December 1972. Gene Cernan climbs the ladder of a lunar module, looks back one final time at a grey, ancient, silent world beneath his boots, and steps inside. The hatch closes, and for the next 53 years, no human being goes back. Not one. An entire civilization, the internet, the smartphone, the mapping of the human genome, the sequencing of the universe itself, all of it happens inside that silence, inside that waiting. And now, 4 people are about to break it. But here is what nobody is telling you about this mission. The spacecraft they are trusting with their lives already came home once, without a crew, and when engineers opened it up, they found the heat shield had cracked in over 100 places. The very thing designed to keep human beings from burning alive at half the temperature of the sun's surface. Cracked, and NASA looked at those cracks, spent 2 years studying them, and made a decision that will either be remembered as brilliant engineering judgment, or the most consequential gamble in the history of human spaceflight. They sent people anyway. If you have ever wanted to understand what it truly takes to leave this world, stay with us tonight. And if this kind of storytelling moves you, subscribing and leaving a like costs you nothing but means everything to this channel. Let's begin. The last time a human being left Earth's neighbourhood and flew to the moon, the year was 1972. Richard Nixon was president. The internet did not exist. Mobile phones did not exist. The world had never heard of personal computers. A gallon of gas cost 36 cents, and 3 men climbed into a capsule called America, rode a Saturn V rocket off the pad at Kennedy Space Center, and flew to a valley on the moon called Taurus Littrow. Their names were Gene Cernan, Ron Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. When Cernan stepped off the lunar surface for the last time, he said he believed we would be back before long. He was wrong. We did not go back. Not that decade, not the next one, not the one after that. An entire generation was born into a world where going to the moon was something that happened in old footage and history books. Children grew up, went to college, got married, raised families, and started going grey. All in the gap between that last mission and this one. 53 years. That is not a pause. That is a forgetting. And if this kind of story matters to you, the kind that sits at the edge of what we know and what we dare, then you're in the right place. Consider subscribing if you have not already, because your support is what keeps these deep journeys going. It costs nothing, and it means everything. Now let us continue. The forgetting was not dramatic. Nobody held a press conference and said we are done with the moon. What happened was slower and quieter. Budgets shrank. Priorities shifted. The Space Shuttle program consumed NASA's energy for 3 decades, flying to low Earth orbit again and again, but never beyond it. The International Space Station became the focus after that, an extraordinary achievement in its own right, a laboratory the size of a football field orbiting 250 miles above the ground. But 250 miles is not the moon. The moon is 240,000 miles away. The difference between those two numbers is the difference between wading into the shallow end of a pool and swimming across the Atlantic Ocean. We got very good at the shallow end. We built a home there. We stayed for 25 years, and the deep water waited. Now finally, 4 people have been chosen to swim. Their names are Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen. And the weight they carry is different from any crew that has come before them. The Apollo astronauts were pioneers, but they were also products of a program that had momentum. Mission followed mission. Lessons learned on one flight fed directly into the next. There was a rhythm, a pace, a living, breathing, institutional memory of how to send humans to the moon. That memory is gone now. The engineers who built the Saturn V have retired or passed away. The flight controllers who guided Apollo through its most dangerous moments are in their 80s and 90s. The muscle memory of deep space human flight does not live in any organisation on Earth anymore. Here it lives in documents, in archives, in old transcripts and fading photographs. The Artemis II crew is not picking up where Apollo left off. They are starting over, and starting over in many ways is harder than starting fresh. Because starting fresh means you have no expectations to meet. Starting over means everyone assumes you already know how to do this. You do not. Not really. Not with this spacecraft. Not with this rocket. Not with this crew. Reed Wiseman is the commander. He's a former Navy test pilot who has flown to the International Space Station and spent nearly 200 days in space. He was the chief of the astronaut office before being assigned to this mission, the person responsible for managing every active astronaut in the Corps. He understands the machinery of NASA from the inside. Victor Glover is the pilot. He's a Navy fighter pilot and test pilot who flew on the first operational mission of SpaceX's Crew Dragon capsule. He has logged over 3,000 hours in more than 40 different aircraft. He will become the first person of colour to fly beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch is a mission specialist. She holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 consecutive days aboard the International Space Station. She has performed 6 spacewalks. She will become the first woman to travel to the moon. Jeremy Hansen is the other mission specialist. He is a Canadian, a fighter pilot from the Royal Canadian Air Force, and this will be his first spaceflight. He will become the first non-American to fly on a lunar mission. 4 people, 4 very different paths that converge in a capsule they have named Integrity. Think about what that name means. Not courage, not glory, not discovery. Integrity. The quality of being whole and undamaged. The quality of holding together under pressure. It is the kind of name you choose when you understand what is really being tested. Not just the spacecraft, not just the rocket. The entire idea that we can do this again. Because here is what most people do not appreciate about the 53-year gap. It did not just cost us time, it cost us confidence. Not public confidence, the public barely noticed. It cost us engineering confidence. The hard-earned, flight-tested, failure-informed understanding of what happens when you push human beings beyond the thin safety net of low Earth orbit and send them into the deep black. Every Apollo mission taught NASA something that could not be learned any other way. How the human body responds to trans-lunar coast. How spacecraft systems behave across 3-day journeys through the radiation environment between Earth and Moon. How crew psychology shifts when the Earth shrinks in the window and the Moon grows, and the distance from rescue becomes real and tangible and enormous. All of that knowledge is documented, but documentation is not experience. A recipe is not a meal. You can read every report ever written about Apollo and still not know what it feels like to commit a spacecraft to the Moon with people inside it. That is what Artemis II is for. Not science, not spectacle. Proof. Proof that the Orion capsule can keep 4 human beings alive and functional in deep space. Proof that the space launch system can deliver them there. Proof that we still have the will, the skill, and the nerve to leave home. The last astronaut to walk on the Moon died in January of 2017. Gene Cernan never saw the program that would eventually carry humans back. He spent the last years of his life giving speeches, doing interviews, gently and persistently asking why we stopped. He never got a satisfying answer. Nobody did. Because there was no single reason. There was just drift. Slow, institutional political drift. The kind that turns a bold promise into a quiet retreat without anyone making a conscious decision to retreat at all. Artemis II is the moment the drift ends, and the 4 people at the centre of it know exactly what that means. They know the spacecraft they're flying has never carried a crew before. They know the rocket beneath them has only flown once. They know the heat shield that will bring them home showed cracks the first time it was used. They know all of this, and they're going anyway. The rocket that will carry these 4 people to the moon is called the Space Launch System, and if you have never heard of it, that is understandable. It does not have the fame of the Saturn V, or the cultural presence of SpaceX's Falcon 9. It has not landed itself on a drone ship, or gone viral on social media. It has flown exactly once. In November of 2022, it launched an uncrewed Orion capsule on the Artemis I mission, sent it around the moon, and brought it home. That single flight was the first and only time this rocket has ever left the ground, and now it is supposed to carry people. But here is what makes the Space Launch System genuinely strange. It is brand new and decades old at the same time. Stand at the base of it and look up. 322 feet tall. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty, pedestal included. Fully loaded with fuel and payload, it weighs 5.75 million pounds. For some sense of what that mass means, think of a fully loaded Boeing 747, one of the heaviest commercial aircraft ever built. Now multiply that by 8. That is the weight sitting on the launch pad. Most of it is propellant, liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, packed into the massive orange core stage that dominates the centre of the rocket. On either side, 2 solid rocket boosters, each one 177 feet long, each one producing more thrust by itself than the entire main engine cluster of a Saturn V. When the countdown reaches 0, those 4 main engines and those 2 solid boosters ignite together. The combined thrust is 8.8 million pounds of force. That is 15% more powerful than the Saturn V, which means the Space Launch System is the most powerful rocket NASA has ever launched. More powerful than anything that carried astronauts during Apollo. More powerful than anything that flew during the shuttle era. On paper, it is a monster. But look closer. Look at the engines. The 4 main engines on the core stage are called RS-25s. And if that name sounds familiar, it should. These are the same engines that powered the space shuttle for 30 years. Not the same design. The actual same engines. The ones bolted to the bottom of the SLS core stage were pulled from shuttles that flew missions in the 1980s, 90s and 2000s. They have been inspected, overhauled, recertified, and adapted for a vehicle they were never built to fly on. During the shuttle program, these engines were reusable. They launched, came home with the orbiter, got refurbished, and launched again. On the SLS, they are expendable. They fire once, fall into the ocean with the spent core stage, and sink. Engines that were designed to fly dozens of missions are now being thrown away after a single use. There is a reason for this, and it is not a good one. It is a political and budgetary reason. When the shuttle program ended in 2011, NASA had a stockpile of RS-25 engines and solid rocket booster segments sitting in warehouses. Congress directed NASA to build a new heavy-lift rocket using as much existing shuttle hardware as possible. The logic was simple. Reuse what you already have and you save money and time. The reality turned out to be far more complicated. Adapting 30-year-old engine technology to a rocket with completely different flight profiles, thrust requirements, and structural loads took years longer and cost billions more than anyone initially projected. The RS-25s needed new controllers, new nozzles, new software. The solid rocket boosters needed an extra segment added to each one, stretching them from 4 segments to 5 to produce the additional thrust the SLS demanded. The result is a rocket that looks revolutionary, but is built from inheritance. And that contradiction sits at the heart of the Artemis program. Think of it this way. Imagine someone hands you the engine from a 1992 pickup truck and tells you to build the fastest car on the planet around it. You can modify the engine, you can upgrade its parts, but you cannot start from scratch. You must use this engine because it already exists, and it already has funding approval. You might succeed, you might build something extraordinary, but the thing you build will always carry the DNA of the truck it came from. That is the Space Launch System. None of this means the rocket is unsafe. The RS-25 is one of the most tested and well understood rocket engines in history. It has a flight record stretching back to 1981. Engineers know its failure modes, its thermal limits, its performance curves under every conceivable condition. The solid rocket boosters have a similarly deep heritage. These are proven machines. What is unproven is the way they have been assembled together into this specific vehicle. The SLS has only flown once, and on that single flight it performed well. The core stage delivered its thrust as expected. The boosters separated cleanly. The upper stage fired on time and pushed Orion toward the moon. Engineers called it a successful first flight. But one flight does not build confidence the way 20 flights do. One success is a data point. It is not a pattern, and the crew of Artemis II knows this. They are climbing aboard a rocket that has a sample size of 1. The upper stage is a different story entirely. Called the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, it sits between the core and the Orion spacecraft. It is powered by a single RL-10 engine, burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Its job is specific and critical. After the core stage burns out and falls away, the upper stage fires to push Orion into a stable orbit, and then it fires again to perform the trans-lunar injection burn that sends the spacecraft toward the moon. That second firing is the most consequential moment of the entire launch sequence. If it works, you're going to the moon. If it does not, you're stuck in Earth orbit with no way to get there. The word interim in its name tells you something important. Then this upper stage was always meant to be temporary. NASA planned to replace it with a more powerful version called the Exploration Upper Stage. But the Exploration Upper Stage is not ready. It will not fly until Artemis IV at the earliest. So for Artemis II, the crew rides on a stopgap, a stage borrowed from the Delta IV rocket family and adapted for a role it was not originally designed to fill. Another piece of recycled heritage, another compromise between ambition and budget. Sitting on top of all of this is the Orion spacecraft, protected during launch by a launch abort system, a tower mounted above the capsule packed with solid rocket motors that can fire in a fraction of a second and pull the crew module away from a failing rocket. If something goes catastrophically wrong during the first 2 minutes of flight, the abort system activates, yanks Orion free, and carries it far enough away to deploy parachutes and bring the crew down safely. It is the last line of defense. The thing nobody wants to use and everyone is grateful exists. Below the crew, 5.75 million pounds of metal, fuel and fire. Above them, a tower designed to save their lives if everything below them fails. And in between, 4 people in pressure suits strapped into seats waiting for the countdown to reach 0. The most powerful rocket ever built by NASA, assembled from the bones of programs that ended years ago, proven exactly once, and about to carry humans for the first time. That is the machine beneath them. There is no way to prepare for what happens next. You can train for it. You can simulate it. You can sit in a centrifuge and feel the G-forces build until your vision narrows and your chest feels like someone parked a car on it. But the real thing is different. Every astronaut who has ever launched on a rocket says the same thing. The simulation gets close. The reality is something else. The countdown reaches 0. And for a half second, nothing seems to happen. Then the RS-25 engines ignite. 4 of them, firing simultaneously, producing nearly 2 million pounds of thrust before the rocket has moved a single inch. The sound does not reach the crew right away, because sound travels slower than the shock wave moving through the structure of the vehicle itself. What they feel first is vibration, a low, deep shudder that moves through the launch pad, through the rocket, through their seats, through their spines. Then, half a second later, the two solid rocket boosters light. This is the moment the world changes. 8.8 million pounds of thrust. The human mind does not have a category for that number. Try this instead. Imagine every car on a 10-lane highway, bumper to bumper, stretching from New York to Los Angeles, all accelerating at the same time. That is roughly the force being generated beneath 4 human beings sitting in a cabin smaller than a large bathroom. The rocket does not ease off the pad, it shoves. The hold-down clamps release and the SLS climbs, and the word climbs is too gentle for what is happening. It is being thrown upward by a continuous explosion. Inside the capsule, the crew feels the acceleration immediately. They're pushed into their seats with a force that builds steadily over the first 2 minutes. At peak, they experience roughly 3 times the force of gravity. That sounds manageable if you have never felt it. It is not. At 3 Gs, your body weighs 3 times what it normally does. A 180-pound man becomes 540 pounds. His arms weigh as much as small children. Lifting a hand to flip a switch on the instrument panel requires real effort. Breathing becomes shallow and deliberate because the muscles that expand your rib cage are working against 3 times their usual load. Your vision does not fail, but it narrows. The edges go soft. Your heart works harder to pump blood upward to your brain against a gravitational pull that wants to drag everything downward toward your feet. Former astronaut Wendy Lawrence once described what a shuttle launch felt like. She said it was as if someone sat on her chest, a weight so heavy she could not lift her arm in front of her face, and the shuttle produced less thrust than the SLS. The Artemis II crew will experience something more intense than anything Lawrence described. Not dramatically more, but enough to notice, enough to feel the difference in your bones. And then there is the noise, or rather, the vibration that your body interprets as noise. The solid rocket boosters do not produce a clean, smooth thrust. They burn a mixture of aluminum powder, ammonium perchlorate, and polymer binder, in a reaction that is powerful but rough. The thrust oscillates slightly as the fuel grain burns unevenly. That oscillation translates through the entire structure of the rocket as a deep, grinding vibration that rattles everything: the instrument panels, the seats, the helmets, the teeth inside the crew's mouths. Astronauts who have flown on rockets with solid boosters describe it as riding a freight train over gravel at 200 miles an hour. It is not elegant, it is violent, and it does not stop for 2 full minutes. 2 minutes. That is how long the solid boosters burn. 120 seconds of bone-level shaking while the rocket accelerates through the lower atmosphere, pushing through the sound barrier, pushing through maximum dynamic pressure. The moment when the combination of speed and atmospheric density puts the greatest structural stress on the vehicle. This is the point where the rocket is most vulnerable. If something is going to break, this is when it breaks. The SLS passed through Max Q successfully on Artemis I. There is every reason to believe it will do so again. But belief and certainty are not the same thing, and every crew member knows the difference. Then, at roughly 2 minutes after launch, the solid rocket boosters burn out. They have consumed all their fuel. Explosive bolts fire, and the 2 spent casings separate from the core stage and tumble away toward the Atlantic Ocean below. And in that instant, something remarkable happens. The ride transforms, the deep shaking stops, the roar drops. The acceleration smooths out into a steady, clean push as the 4 RS-25 liquid-fueled engines continue to fire alone, driving the rocket higher and faster without the rough edges of solid propellant combustion. Astronauts describe this moment as going from riding a rodeo bull to gliding on a rail. The contrast is so sharp it almost feels like something went wrong. It did not. It just got quieter. For the next 6 minutes, the core stage engines burn through the remaining liquid hydrogen and oxygen, accelerating the spacecraft to orbital velocity, about 17,500 miles per hour, 25 times the speed of sound. Fast enough that if you could somehow drive your car at highway speed without stopping, it would take you more than 10 months to cover the distance these 4 people just covered in 8 minutes. Then, main engine cut off, the RS-25s shut down, and the silence arrives. It is not the ordinary silence of a quiet room. It is the silence of something enormous stopping. For 8 minutes the crew has been pressed into their seats by a force that made their bodies 3 times heavier, surrounded by vibration and noise and the raw sensation of being hurled upward at impossible speed. And then it stops, all of it, at once. The engines go quiet, the acceleration drops to 0, and gravity, the thing that has pulled on their bodies every second of every day of their entire lives, simply vanishes. Their arms float upward from their laps, not because anything is pushing them, because nothing is pulling them down anymore. Small objects, a pen, a checklist card, a crumb from a snack bar someone packed, lift gently off surfaces and hang in the air like they have forgotten which way to fall. The crew's bodies, still strapped into their seats, suddenly feel weightless. The pressure on their chests is gone, the heaviness is gone, everything is gone except the gentle hum of the life support fans and the slow, quiet realization that they are now in space. This is the moment. The one no simulator fully captures. Not the noise, not the shaking, not the G-forces. This, the sudden, absolute absence of weight. The feeling that the floor has dropped away from beneath you and never come back. Some astronauts describe it as falling. Not falling downward, just falling. Forever, in every direction, with no ground rushing up to meet you. The core stage separates and falls back toward Earth. The upper stage, still attached to Orion, coasts upward into a preliminary orbit. Outside the 4 small windows of the capsule, the curve of the Earth appears below them. The thin blue line of atmosphere, the impossible thinness of it, glowing against the blackness of space. 8 billion people living beneath a shell of air so fragile it looks like it could be wiped away with a cloth. 8 minutes ago they were on the ground. Now they are circling the planet at 5 miles per second. And the hardest part of the mission has not even started yet. Most people assume that once a spacecraft reaches orbit, the dangerous part is over. You survived the launch. You're floating in space. The hard work is done. This assumption is wrong. For the crew of Artemis II, reaching orbit is not the finish line. It is the beginning of an exam. And the subject of that exam is whether the machine they are sitting inside deserves to be trusted with their lives for the next 10 days. This is the verification phase, and it is unlike anything that has happened on any previous NASA mission. Here is why. Every American spacecraft that has carried humans into orbit before this one, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the Space Shuttle, even SpaceX's Crew Dragon, had been tested with crews in low Earth orbit before being sent on more ambitious missions. The process was always the same. Build the vehicle, test it without people, test it with people close to home, then, only after those tests succeed, send it farther. Apollo followed this pattern carefully. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 went to the Moon only after Apollo 7 proved the capsule worked. Orion has not followed this pattern. Artemis I was an uncrewed test flight. Artemis II is a crewed lunar mission. There was no crewed Earth orbit shakedown flight in between. The crew of Artemis II is testing this spacecraft with people inside it for the very first time, and they are doing it on a mission that will take them 240,000 miles from home. That is why the hours after reaching orbit matter so much. This is where the crew and mission control go through every system on the spacecraft one by one and confirm that Orion is working the way it is supposed to. Life support, the fans circulating oxygen, the scrubbers pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, the temperature regulation keeping the cabin at a livable 72 degrees. Propulsion, the European service module's engines, its fuel supplies, its ability to perform precise burns on command. Navigation, the star trackers, the inertial measurement units, the software that tells the spacecraft exactly where it is and how fast it is moving. Communications, the link with mission control in Houston, the backup channels, the antenna pointing systems that keep the signal locked even as the spacecraft moves. That thermal control, the radiators on the service module that dump excess heat into space, the insulation that keeps critical components from freezing in shadow. Each of these systems was tested on Artemis I. Each one performed well. But Artemis I did not have people on board. And people change everything. People breathe. They exhale carbon dioxide. They generate body heat. They move around and bump into things. They produce moisture through sweat and respiration that the air system has to manage. A spacecraft that works perfectly empty can behave differently with 4 living, breathing, sweating human beings inside it. That is not a guess. That is a lesson learned from every crewed program in history. The first time humans enter any vehicle, surprises appear. But the verification phase is not just about checking gauges and reading numbers off displays. This is where Artemis II does something no one has ever done before with this spacecraft. Reed Wiseman and Victor Glover are going to fly it by hand. Think about what that means. Every spacecraft in the modern era relies heavily on autopilot. The computers calculate the burns, fire the engines, adjust the attitude, and keep the vehicle on course. The crew monitors, they watch, they stand ready to intervene. But the computers do the flying. On Artemis II, Wiseman and Glover will take direct manual control of Orion, using hand controllers and instrument displays. They will perform a series of proximity operations, deliberate maneuvers using the European service module's engines to move the spacecraft precisely through planned patterns. They will change its orientation, adjust its speed, guide it through the kinds of movements that future Artemis missions will require when crews need to dock with the Lunar Gateway Station or position themselves near the Moon's surface for a landing. This is hands on the stick, eyes on the instruments, real piloting in real time in a spacecraft that no human has ever steered before. And it matters because the future of the Artemis program depends on what happens during these maneuvers. Artemis III is supposed to carry astronauts to the lunar surface. Only that mission will require Orion to rendezvous and dock with a SpaceX Starship lander in lunar orbit. Docking is one of the most precise operations in spaceflight. 2 vehicles moving at thousands of miles per hour must match their speed, position, and orientation to within inches. If the crew cannot demonstrate on Artemis II that Orion handles well enough for that kind of precision, the entire downstream plan gets called into question. The European service module is the key to all of this. Built by Airbus for the European Space Agency, it is the cylindrical section bolted to the back of the Orion capsule. If Orion is the brain, the service module is the body. It provides everything the capsule needs to survive in deep space. Propulsion comes from its main engine, a repurposed orbital maneuvering engine from the Space Shuttle program, another piece of inherited hardware given a second life. Surrounding it are 33 smaller engines used for fine adjustments and attitude control. 4 solar array wings extend outward and generate enough electricity to power the spacecraft's systems. Water tanks and gas supplies inside the module keep the crew hydrated and breathing. Without the service module, Orion is a dead shell. With it, Orion can travel to the Moon and back. But here is the thing about the service module that most people do not know. It is also expendable. Before re-entry, the service module separates from the crew capsule and burns up in the atmosphere. Every piece of it is destroyed. The solar arrays, the engines, the tanks, the thermal radiators, all of it is built to be used once and thrown away. This is a spacecraft philosophy fundamentally different from the International Space Station, where modules are designed to last decades. The service module is designed to last 10 days. It just has to work perfectly for 10 days. After that, it becomes debris. During the verification phase, the crew tests every function the service module offers. They fire the engines, they check the solar arrays, they confirm the power systems are delivering the right voltage. They monitor the thermal environment to make sure nothing is running too hot or too cold. They verify that the water dispensers work, that the oxygen flow rates are correct, that the carbon dioxide levels in the cabin are staying within safe limits. All of this data flows to mission control in Houston, where hundreds of engineers sit at consoles watching every number, every graph, every telemetry reading in real time. And here is the question hanging over all of it. The question no one says out loud, but everyone is thinking, is this spacecraft ready? The data from Artemis I said yes. The heat shield said maybe. The engineers who spent 2 years investigating the shield cracking said they understood the problem and the fix was sound. The trajectory has been changed, the procedures have been updated, the risk has been reduced, but reduced is not eliminated. Reduced is not zero. And the crew knows this. They sit in their seats during the verification phase, running through checklists, testing engines, checking systems. And they know that the decision they are about to make, the decision to commit to the moon, is not reversible. Once the trans-lunar injection burn happens, they are going. No space station to dock with, no rescue vehicle waiting in orbit, no second spacecraft trailing behind them just in case. 4 people, 1 capsule, 1 service module, and 250,000 miles of empty space. The verification phase is the last moment where turning back is easy. After this, turning back becomes a matter of physics, not choice. And every system check, every manual maneuver, every data point reviewed during these hours in Earth orbit is one more piece of evidence in the case for going forward. The crew gathers the evidence, they study it, they talk to Houston, and then they make the call. There is a moment on every lunar mission where everything before it becomes a rehearsal, and everything after it becomes irreversible. That moment has a name: trans-lunar injection. 3 words that sound clinical and bureaucratic but describe the single most consequential engine burn of the entire flight. This is the burn that stops Orion from circling Earth and sends it toward the moon. And once it happens, the crew is committed. There is no turning around. There is no pulling over. There is only forward. The burn itself is performed by the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the upper stage of the SLS that has remained attached to Orion since launch. It has already fired once to place the spacecraft into its initial orbit. Now it fires a second time. A single R-10 engine burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, pushing Orion's velocity from roughly 17,500 miles per hour to the speed needed to escape Earth's gravitational hold and coast outward toward the moon. That target speed is approximately 24,500 miles per hour, an increase of 7,000 miles per hour delivered in a single continuous burn lasting several minutes. For the crew, the sensation is nothing like launch. There is no bone-shaking vibration from solid boosters, no crushing 3G acceleration. The upper stage engine produces a steady, smooth push. The force is modest, less than 1 G for most of the burn. It feels like someone pressing a firm hand against your back, persistent, constant, building speed without the violence that mark the first 8 minutes of the flight. But the psychological weight of this moment is enormous, because unlike launch, where the trajectory could be adjusted, where abort options existed at every phase, the trans-lunar injection burn crosses a line. Once Orion reaches escape velocity, Earth's gravity can no longer pull it back into orbit. The spacecraft is now on a path that curves outward through space toward a body 250,000 miles away. The only way home is forward, around the moon and back. When the burn is complete, the upper stage has done its job. Explosive bolts fire. The spent stage separates from Orion and drifts away. It will eventually re-enter Earth's atmosphere and burn up, or it will settle into a long, near looping solar orbit where it will circle the sun as a piece of silent debris for centuries. Either way, it is gone, and Orion is alone. 4 people in a capsule roughly 330 cubic feet. Behind them, the European service module with its engines, solar arrays and life support supplies. Ahead of them, nothing but space, no structure to dock with, no station to visit, no second vehicle following behind as a lifeboat. For the next 4 days they will coast toward the moon carried by momentum, with the service module providing small course corrections along the way to keep them on the precise trajectory they need. This is the part of the mission that most closely resembles what the Apollo astronauts experienced. And it is also the part that most clearly reveals how alone you really are. Think about what alone means in this context. On the International Space Station, you're in low Earth orbit. You're 250 miles above the surface. If something goes wrong, a medical emergency, a critical system failure, a fire, you can climb into a Soyuz or Crew Dragon capsule and be on the ground in a matter of hours. Rescue is always close. The Earth fills your entire window. You can see cities at night, storms during the day, the blue curve of the ocean beneath you. You're in space, but you are not far from home. On Artemis II, home is leaving. Every hour after the trans-lunar injection burn, Earth gets smaller, not metaphorically smaller, literally smaller. The planet that fills the entire window during low Earth orbit begins to shrink. After a few hours, you can see the whole disk, the entire Earth, pole to pole, fitting inside a single window frame. After a day, it is the size of a baseball held at arm's length. After 2 days, it is the size of a marble. By the time you approach the moon, the Earth visible through your window is small enough to cover with your thumb. Hold up your thumb right now. Look at the tip of it. That is the size of everything. Every person you have ever known, every city you have ever visited, every ocean, every mountain, every forest, hidden behind a fingertip. The Apollo 8 astronauts were the first humans to experience this. Young Frank Borman described a moment during the outbound coast when he looked back at Earth and realized he could no longer distinguish continents. The planet had become a bright blue dot surrounded by absolute blackness. He said it was the most isolating thing he had ever experienced. Not frightening exactly, but deeply, fundamentally disorienting. Because your entire life, the Earth has been the ground beneath you. It has been the thing that holds you, the thing that defines up and down, day and night, here and there. And now it is a dot, a small, bright, fragile dot, shrinking into the dark behind you while you move toward a grey, cratered world that has never held a living thing. The communication delay reinforces this isolation in a subtle but real way. At the moon, radio signals take about 1.3 seconds to travel each direction. That means when the crew says something to Houston, the reply arrives 2.6 seconds later at best. That does not sound like much, but try having a conversation where every response is delayed by nearly 3 seconds. The rhythm breaks. The natural flow of human dialogue, the interruptions, the overlaps, the quick back and forth, becomes impossible. You speak. You wait. The answer comes back slightly too late. It is a small thing, but over 4 days of coasting through empty space, it is a constant, quiet reminder that you are not where people normally are. And this is where something important must be said about the free return trajectory. because it is the only safety net these 4 people have. A free return trajectory is a flight path carefully designed so that if the spacecraft's main engine fails completely, if the service module loses all propulsion and the crew cannot perform any burns at all, the moon's gravity will bend the spacecraft's path around the far side and send it back toward Earth automatically. No engine required, just gravity and geometry. This is the same emergency path that saved the crew of Apollo 13 in 1970, when their service module was crippled by an explosion halfway to the moon. The free return trajectory carried them around the far side and aimed them back home. They still had to make corrections using the lunar module's engine, but the basic path was there. Gravity provided the road. The crew just had to stay on it. And Artemis II is designed to fly this same kind of path. If everything works perfectly, the service module engines will perform planned burns to adjust the trajectory and shape the flyby exactly the way mission planners want. But if everything fails, if the worst case happens, the free return is there. A gravitational safety net stretched across 250,000 miles of empty space. It is not a comfortable backup plan. It is a slow one. A powerless coast around the moon and back to Earth would take days. Days without propulsion. Days relying entirely on the capsule's life support and battery power. Days where a single additional failure, a leak, a short circuit, a cracked seal, could turn a survival emergency into an unsurvivable one. But it exists. It is real. It is physics, not hope. And right now, coasting outward in the silence after the trans-lunar injection burn, with the Earth shrinking behind them and the moon still days away, the crew of Artemis II carries that knowledge with them. The free return is their net, the service module is their engine, and the thin walls of the Orion capsule are the only thing between their living bodies and the vacuum of space. Forward, that is the only direction left. You would think that travelling to the moon would feel grand, that the experience of crossing 250,000 miles of space would carry some sense of vastness, some physical awareness of the distance being covered. It does not. Inside the Orion capsule, the journey feels small, impossibly, absurdly small, because the space these 4 people are living in for 10 days is roughly 330 cubic feet. NASA compares that to 2 minivans, and the comparison is accurate in volume but misleading in feel. A minivan has windows on every side, doors you can open, and the freedom to pull over and step outside whenever you want. Orion has 4 small windows, one hatch that does not open until splashdown and nowhere to go. For the next 4 days, as the spacecraft coasts toward the moon, this capsule is home. And home on Artemis II is a lesson in learning to live without almost everything you take for granted on Earth. Start with the most basic thing. Space. Physical space. Once the crew reaches orbit and the seats are no longer needed for launch, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen stow the footpans and fold some equipment away to open up as much room as possible. This helps. But the capsule is still a metal cylinder packed with equipment, storage lockers, instrument panels, and life support hardware. 4 adults share this volume the way 4 strangers might share an elevator, except the elevator ride lasts 10 days and there are no floors to get off at. Microgravity helps. Christina Koch once said she was counting on weightlessness to make the cabin feel larger, because when you can float, the ceiling becomes usable space. You're no longer limited to the floor. Every surface becomes a potential place to work, rest, or store something. Astronauts on the International Space Station use this trick constantly, sleeping on walls, working on ceilings, orienting themselves in whatever direction feels most convenient at the moment. The Artemis II crew will do the same, but the station has roughly 32,000 cubic feet of pressurized volume. Orion has 330. The station is a house. Orion is a closet. Now consider food. There is no kitchen on Orion. There is no refrigerator. There is no microwave. There is no table to sit at and no chairs to sit in. Which is a strange sentence to write about a place where people will live for more than a week. Food comes in pouches, sealed, lightweight packages of freeze-dried or thermostabilized meals that were chosen by the astronauts months before launch during food tastings at NASA's Space Food Systems laboratory. The menu includes things like shrimp cocktail, macaroni and cheese, and tortillas. Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian crew member, packed maple products and salmon bites from home. The crew rehydrates the freeze-dried meals using a water dispenser and warms some of them on a small hot plate with limited capacity. Most meals are eaten at room temperature. You squeeze food out of a pouch. You chase floating crumbs before they drift into an air filter and clog it. You wash it down with water from a pressurized bag. That is breakfast. That is lunch. That is dinner for 10 days. The water they drink was loaded onto the spacecraft before launch. Every drop of it. There is no water recycling system on Artemis II. The International Space Station has a sophisticated system that recovers water from humidity in the air, from sweat, even from urine. It can recycle roughly 90% of all water on board. Orion has none of that. The mission is short enough that carrying all the water they need is feasible, but it also means there is a finite supply. Every cup consumed is one less cup available. Every drop matters. Now consider the toilet. It occupies about 5 cubic feet under the floor near the main hatch. There is a curtain for privacy. One curtain. That is the only door in the entire spacecraft that offers any separation between one crew member and the other 3. The waste system collects urine and vents it into space. Solid waste goes into bags that are sealed and stored for the return trip. Think about that. Sealed bags of human waste, stored inside a capsule the size of 2 minivans for up to 10 days, alongside the people who produced them. The engineers designed the sealing system to contain odour. Whether it succeeds completely in a closed environment with 4 people and recycled air is a question that only experience will answer. Hygiene is minimal. There are no showers. The crew cleans up with wet wipes, liquid soap and dry shampoo. Their personal hygiene kits include toothbrushes, razors and a hairbrush. You brush your teeth and then swallow the toothpaste or spit it into a wipe. There is no sink. There is no running water in the way you understand running water. Everything is done in a small area near the toilet, which means the bathroom is also the shower, the sink and the grooming station, all in 5 cubic feet. Sleep is scheduled carefully. 8 hours per day for most of the mission, though the first day is compressed and the crew catches rest in broken shifts. They sleep in lightweight bags tethered to the walls of the capsule. All 4 crew members sleep at the same time for most of the mission. There is no separate sleeping area. There is no bedroom. You zip yourself into a bag. Float against the wall and try to sleep while 3 other people breathe and shift and make small noises a few feet away from you. The hum of the life support system fills the cabin constantly. Fans circulating oxygen, scrubbers removing carbon dioxide, pumps managing temperature. It is not quiet. It is the sound of a machine keeping you alive. And after a few days, it becomes background noise. The thing you stop hearing consciously, but that your brain never fully ignores. Exercise is mandatory. 30 minutes every day on a device called a flywheel, installed below the side hatch. It doubles as the step the crew uses to climb into the capsule on launch day. The flywheel works like a cable resistance machine, offering exercises like squats, deadlifts, and rowing movements. It can produce up to 400 pounds of resistance, which sounds substantial until you compare it to the exercise equipment on the International Space Station. The station has multiple machines, a treadmill, a stationary bicycle, a resistance device, collectively weighing over 4,000 pounds and filling 850 cubic feet. the Artemis II crew gets a gadget the size of a carry-on suitcase. For a 10-day mission, it is enough to slow the muscle and bone loss that begins almost immediately when gravity disappears. Human bones lose calcium at a rate of about 1 to 2% per month in microgravity. Muscles begin to atrophy within days. The flywheel cannot prevent this. It can only slow it down. Entertainment exists but is limited. The crew has tablets and laptops loaded with procedures and mission data, but also with music, movies, and personal content they selected before launch. Nobody at NASA has publicly revealed what is on the playlist. Communication with family is possible through video calls routed through mission control. These are not private in the traditional sense. They pass through NASA's systems, but they offer a connection to the people waiting on the ground. A child's face on a screen. A partner's voice arriving 1.3 seconds late. Small comforts measured across an enormous distance. This is daily life on Artemis II. No glamour, no drama. Just 4 people in a metal tube doing the mundane work of existing while the universe slides past their windows, eating from pouches, sleeping against walls, exercising on a gadget, sharing a toilet behind a curtain, and somehow, amid all of this smallness, doing something no one has done in half a century. The moon is getting closer, and the capsule is not getting any bigger. There is a danger on this mission that the crew cannot see, cannot hear, cannot feel, and cannot escape. It passes through the walls of the spacecraft without slowing down. It passes through their flight suits. It passes through their skin, their muscle, their bone. It reaches into their cells and strikes the DNA coiled inside, breaking strands, scrambling code, leaving behind damage that the body may or may not repair correctly. It does all of this in perfect silence, with no sensation at all. You do not feel radiation, you absorb it, and by the time you know it hurt you, it is already too late to undo. This is the invisible threat that separates a trip to low Earth orbit from a trip to the moon, and it is the reason that Artemis II is not just a test of the spacecraft. Yeah, it is a test of whether human biology can endure the journey. Here is what most people do not understand about radiation in space. When you're on the International Space Station, orbiting 250 miles above the Earth, you're still inside the planet's magnetic field. Earth generates an enormous magnetosphere, a bubble of magnetic force that extends tens of thousands of miles into space. This bubble acts as a shield. Charged particles streaming from the sun, protons, electrons, heavy ions moving at significant fractions of the speed of light, slam into the magnetosphere and are deflected, redirected, channeled toward the poles where they produce the auroras. The station sits inside this bubble. It is not perfectly protected. Astronauts on the station absorb more radiation than people on the ground, roughly 10 times more, but the magnetosphere blocks the worst of it. The most dangerous particles, the highest energy cosmic rays, are largely kept at bay. Leave that bubble and everything changes. The Artemis II crew will fly beyond the magnetosphere. They will spend days in a region of space where Earth's magnetic field offers no protection at all. And in that region, 2 types of radiation become serious concerns. The first is galactic cosmic rays. These are not from the sun. They come from outside our solar system entirely, produced by supernova explosions, neutron star collisions, and other violent events scattered across the galaxy. They are atomic nuclei stripped of their electrons and accelerated to extraordinary energies. Some of them have been travelling through space for millions of years before they reach our solar system. They arrive from every direction, constantly, and there is no practical way to shield against all of them. The highest energy cosmic rays can pass through several feet of solid metal without being stopped. The walls of the Orion capsule are measured in inches. To these particles, the spacecraft might as well be made of paper. When a galactic cosmic ray strikes a human cell, it can break both strands of the DNA double helix simultaneously. Single-strand breaks are common, and the body repairs them routinely. Double-strand breaks are different. They are harder to fix. When the repair goes wrong, when the cell stitches the broken strands back together incorrectly, the result can be a mutation. Most mutations are harmless, some are not. Over time, accumulated mutations can lead to cancer. This is not speculation. It is the established science of radiation biology, confirmed by decades of research on radiation exposure in medical patients, nuclear workers, and astronauts returning from long-duration missions. The second type of radiation is solar energetic particles. These come from the sun itself, produced during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Enormous eruptions that blast billions of tons of charged material outward through the solar system at speeds reaching several million miles per hour. Most of the time, these events are manageable. The particles arrive in a broad wave and the exposure is moderate, but occasionally the sun produces what is called a solar particle event, a sudden, intense burst of high-energy protons that can deliver a dangerous radiation dose in a matter of hours. On Earth, you would never notice. The magnetosphere and the atmosphere together provide shielding equivalent to roughly 13 feet of concrete above your head. On the International Space Station, the magnetosphere still helps, and the station structure provides some additional shielding. But on Artemis II, beyond the magnetosphere, with nothing between the crew and the sun except a few inches of spacecraft hull, a major solar particle event could be genuinely dangerous. Orion has some protection. The spacecraft was designed with radiation in mind. Certain areas of the capsule, particularly the storage bays and the space near the toilet, provide slightly more shielding than others because of the equipment and supplies packed around them. During a solar particle event, the crew is trained to move into these areas and wait. They gather in the most shielded part of the capsule, surrounded by water bags, food supplies, and equipment that absorb some of the incoming radiation, and they stay there until NASA's space weather team gives the all clear. Think about what that means in practical terms. A solar storm erupts on the surface of the sun. Billions of tons of charged material race outward at 1,000,000 miles per hour. NASA's monitoring satellites detect the event and calculate that the particles will reach the moon's vicinity within an hour, maybe two. The crew of Artemis II receives a warning from Houston. They stop whatever they are doing, move to the most protected corner of their tiny capsule, a space near the toilet surrounded by storage bags, and they crouch there, waiting, unable to see the threat, unable to feel it, just trusting the numbers, trusting that the shielding is enough, trusting that the storm will pass before the dose becomes dangerous. NASA's space weather forecasting has improved enormously in recent years. Solar monitoring satellites like the Solar Dynamics Observatory and the GOES spacecraft provide real-time data on solar activity. Models can predict the arrival time and intensity of particle events with reasonable accuracy, but reasonable accuracy is not certainty. The sun is a dynamic, complicated, and occasionally unpredictable star. A quiet period can turn violent without warning. A minor flare can escalate into a major event faster than models predict. And if that happens while the Artemis II crew is on the far side of the moon, the side that faces away from Earth, where direct communication is blocked by 2,000 miles of solid rock, the crew will be on their own. No real-time updates from Houston, no telemetry link, just the instruments on board and their own training. The radiation dosimeters inside Orion track exposure continuously. Each crew member wears a personal dosimeter as well. The data from these instruments is one of the most important scientific products of the entire mission, because no human has been beyond Earth's magnetosphere since 1972. The Apollo missions provided some radiation data, but the instruments of that era were far less precise than what Orion carries. Artemis II will produce the most detailed measurements ever recorded of the deep space radiation environment, as experienced by a crewed spacecraft. That data will feed directly into planning for Artemis III, for future lunar surface missions, and eventually for missions to Mars, where the transit time is measured in months and the radiation exposure becomes a defining constraint on human survival. There is a question at the centre of all this that science has not yet fully answered. How much deep space radiation can a human body absorb over a lifetime without unacceptable risk? NASA sets career exposure limits for its astronauts, but those limits are based on models and estimates, not on direct long-term observation of humans living beyond the magnetosphere. We simply do not have enough data. The Apollo crews spent days in deep space. Future Mars crews will spend years. Somewhere between those two durations lies a boundary, a line where the cumulative damage to cells, tissues, and DNA crosses from acceptable to dangerous. We do not know exactly where that line is. Artemis II will not answer the question completely, but it will bring us closer. 4 human bodies travelling through the radiation environment of deep space, measured with modern instruments, and tracked over the years and decades that follow. The invisible threat does not announce itself. It does not knock on the hull or light up the windows. It simply passes through, quietly, constantly. And the only evidence it was ever there is written in the cells of the people who carried it home. On the 4th day of the mission, something changes. It is not a system alert. It is not a scheduled event on the mission timeline. It is something that happens in the windows. The moon, which has been a bright disk growing steadily larger since the trans-lunar injection burn, is now enormous. It fills the frame. Its surface detail is visible. Craters, ridges, highland regions, the dark patches of ancient lava flows called Maria. And the Earth, behind them, has finished shrinking. It is no longer a planet you can see. It is a bright point of light, vivid and blue and impossibly small against a sky that contains no stars bright enough to compete with it, but no sky at all in the way you understand sky, just black. Absolute, total, lightless black, with one small blue dot hanging in it. This is the moment the mission stops being an engineering exercise and becomes something else entirely. Artemis II will not land on the moon. This is important to understand clearly. The crew will not touch the surface. They will not walk in lunar dust. They will not plant a flag or collect samples or leave boot prints in the regolith. This mission is a flyby, a long looping path that takes Orion around the far side of the moon and back toward Earth. But the word flyby understates what is actually happening, because the path Artemis II follows takes it farther from Earth than any crewed spacecraft has travelled since the Apollo program ended. And it does something more significant than that. It exceeds a record that has stood for 53 years. The previous distance record for a crewed spacecraft was set in April of 1970. Not by a mission that planned to set it, by a mission that nearly killed everyone aboard. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970, bound for the Fromaro Highlands on the Moon. 56 hours into the flight, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The main engine was lost. Power was failing. The crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes, moved into the lunar module, which had its own power supply and oxygen, and used it as a lifeboat. The only way home was the free return trajectory, the gravitational path that would swing the spacecraft around the moon and aim it back at Earth. They could not go directly home. They had to go around the moon first, and in doing so, at their farthest point from Earth on that forced trajectory, the Apollo 13 crew reached a distance of roughly 248,000 miles from home. A record nobody wanted to set. A record born from catastrophe. The Artemis II crew will exceed it, deliberately. At their farthest point, the Artemis II astronauts will be approximately 270,000 miles from Earth, roughly 4,700 miles beyond the Moon's far side, the hemisphere that permanently faces away from Earth, never seen from the surface of our planet, never observed by human eyes at close range since the final Apollo missions. To reach that point, Orion will swing around the moon using a trajectory that takes it behind the lunar disk completely, cutting off all direct communication with Earth for a period as the moon's bulk blocks every radio signal between the spacecraft and the planet behind it. During those minutes of communication blackout, the crew of Artemis II will be the most isolated human beings in the history of our species, not just the farthest from home, the most completely cut off, no radio link, no data stream, no voice from Houston, no telemetry, no connection of any kind to the world that made them. Just 4 people on the far side of the moon, 270,000 miles from the nearest other human being, in a capsule that hums and breathes and keeps them alive in the middle of an incomprehensible silence. Hold your thumb up at arm's length. Look at the tip of it. Now imagine that the entire Earth, every city, every ocean, every person who has ever lived, every building ever constructed, every forest, every mountain range, every coastline, every grain of sand on every beach, fits behind that thumbnail. That is what the Earth looks like from where Artemis II will be at its farthest point. It is not a poetic description. It is a geometrically accurate one. At 270,000 miles, the Earth subtends an angle of roughly 1.8 degrees in the sky. Your thumbnail held at arm's length covers about 2 degrees. The entire planet disappears behind your fingernail. The Apollo 8 astronauts described this experience in ways that have stayed with people for more than half a century. Frank Borman called it a profound loneliness, unlike anything he had felt before. Bill Anders, who took the famous Earthrise photograph, said the sight of Earth from that distance permanently changed his understanding of what mattered. Jim Lovell looked at the planet and realized he could cover it with his thumb, and felt for a moment the full weight of how small everything he had ever known actually was. These were men who had trained for years, men who understood intellectually what the distance would mean, and still the experience exceeded their preparation. The Artemis II crew will go farther than any of them. And there is a scientific dimension to this farthest point that extends beyond the human drama of it. The far side of the moon is not simply the back of a familiar object, it is a different world from the face we see. The near side of the moon, the hemisphere that always faces Earth, is covered with large dark plains called Maria, ancient seas of solidified basalt that formed when volcanic activity flooded low-lying regions billions of years ago. The far side has far fewer of these plains. It is more heavily cratered, more rugged, with a thicker crust and a surface that tells a different story about the moon's geological history. Scientists believe the difference between the two hemispheres may be connected to how the moon formed and how its interior evolved over time. But the precise explanation remains one of the genuinely open questions in planetary science. No human has observed the far side of the moon directly since the cruise of Apollo 17 in 1972. Chinese robotic missions have landed there in recent years and returned valuable data, but robots do not carry the full suite of observational capability that a trained human crew brings. Wiseman, Glover, Koch and Hansen will photograph the far side extensively. They will record high-definition video of features that have never been captured at this resolution from this angle. They will monitor their instruments, note anomalies, document observations that will feed directly into planning for the landing missions that follow. This is not sightseeing dressed up as science, or it is science performed by people who can recognize when something unexpected appears in their window and decide in real time how to respond to it. There is also a psychological dimension to this moment that matters deeply and is almost impossible to fully convey. These 4 people, at the farthest point of their trajectory, will experience something that every other human being on Earth has never felt and may never feel. The complete physical absence of home. Not the absence you feel when you travel to another country or spend months on a research station in Antarctica. Something more fundamental. the knowledge that the world that made you, the air you grew up breathing, the gravity that shaped your skeleton, the light that governed every day of your life, is a faint blue point in a black sky, and reachable only by a journey measured in days and powered by a machine that cracked the last time someone tried to bring it home. The Apollo 8 crew called it the most profound loneliness they had ever experienced. The Artemis II crew will go even farther. And what they feel at that farthest point, what thought crosses each of their minds in that silence, on that far side, with the Earth hidden and Houston unreachable, is something only they will ever know. There is a side of the moon that no one on Earth has ever seen with their own eyes. Not from the ground, not from a telescope, not from any window of any house or observatory on the surface of this planet. The moon keeps one face permanently turned toward Earth, locked in what astronomers call tidal synchrony, a gravitational relationship so consistent and so ancient that the far side of the moon has been hidden from human view for the entire history of our species. Every myth, every poem, every painting, every photograph ever taken of the moon from Earth shows the same face. The other half has been a mystery for as long as people have looked up at the night sky. Humans first saw it in 1959, when the Soviet Luna 3 spacecraft swung around the moon and transmitted blurry, low-resolution photographs back to Earth. The images were rough and incomplete, but they revealed something surprising. The far side looked nothing like the near side. There were almost no Maria, none of those large dark plains that give the moon its familiar spotted appearance when you look up at it on a clear night. Instead, there were craters, vast numbers of them, overlapping ancient relentless craters covering almost the entire surface. The far side of the moon was not a gentler, quieter version of the face we knew. It was a completely different geological environment wearing the same basic shape. Since those first photographs, robotic spacecraft have mapped the far side extensively. China's Chang'e 4 mission landed there in January of 2019. The first soft landing ever achieved on the lunar far side, and its Yutu-2 rover has been exploring the von Karman crater ever since. Orbital missions have built detailed topographic maps. We know the elevation of the mountains, we know the depth of the craters, we have chemical composition data from spectrometers, we have gravitational maps produced by spacecraft tracking tiny variations in their orbital paths as they fly over different surface features. What we have never had is a human being looking at it, and that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. When the Artemis II crew swings around the moon and the far side fills their windows, they will be doing something that no instrument, no rover, no orbiting satellite can replicate. They will be observing with trained human eyes that can notice things cameras miss. A colour shift in a crater wall that suggests something geologically interesting. A shadow pattern that looks different from the maps. A surface feature that the orbital data shows one way, but that human visual judgment interprets differently. Astronauts on Apollo missions consistently returned with observations that enriched and sometimes corrected what robotic precursor missions had suggested. The human eye, connected to a trained human brain, processes visual information in ways that automated systems still cannot fully match. The far side of the moon presents several genuine scientific puzzles that the Artemis II crew will help investigate. The most significant is the asymmetry itself, the stark difference between the two hemispheres. The near side has about 30% of its surface covered by Maria. The far side has less than 1%. The crust on the far side is on average about 5 miles thicker than the crust on the near side. These differences are not random. They tell a story about how the moon formed and how its interior evolved. But scientists disagree about what that story is. One leading hypothesis suggests that in the early solar system, when the moon was young and its interior was still partially molten, The crust on the near side cooled more slowly because Earth's gravitational influence kept that hemisphere slightly warmer. This slower cooling allowed the crust to remain thin longer, which in turn made it easier for volcanic magma to punch through and flood the surface, creating the Maria we see today. The far side, cooling faster, developed a thicker crust that was harder for magma to penetrate. This would explain both the thicker crust and the absence of large volcanic plains. Another hypothesis involves a massive ancient impact. Researchers have proposed that early in the Moon's history, a second smaller moon, a companion body formed from the same debris cloud, eventually drifted too close and collided with the far side at low velocity. The impact would not have created a crater in the traditional sense. It would have spread material across the far side, thickening the crust and suppressing volcanic activity on that hemisphere. This is a genuinely contested idea in planetary science. There is evidence for it and evidence against it. The debate is ongoing. What the Artemis II crew observes during their flyby will contribute real data to this conversation. The crew will also be paying close attention to a feature called the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the largest and oldest impact craters in the entire solar system. It is roughly 1,600 miles across and about 5 miles deep, carved by an asteroid impact so enormous that it punched down through the lunar crust into the upper mantle. Material excavated from that depth, material that formed deep inside the Moon billions of years ago, is scattered across the basin floor and surrounding region, and understanding what that material is made of tells us about the Moon's interior composition in a way that surface sampling in other regions cannot. Future landing missions, including Artemis III and those that follow, are targeting this region precisely. The data Artemis II collects during its flyby will help refine where exactly to land and what to look for when they get there. Beyond the science, there is a quality to this part of the mission that defies easy description. The far side of the Moon is silent in a radio sense. Because the Moon's bulk blocks signals from Earth, there is no electromagnetic noise from human civilization reaching that surface, no television broadcasts, no satellite signals, no Wi-Fi, no radio chatter. The far side is the quietest place in the inner solar system from a radio frequency perspective. When the crew passes over it, their own communications with Houston are blocked. The silence is not just poetic, it is literal. And for a few minutes, as Orion swings behind the Moon and the far side passes beneath their windows, they will be the only conscious things in a vast, ancient, geologically complex world that has never heard a human voice. There is one more thing worth saying about this moment. The far side of the Moon is where China intends to build a permanent research base as part of its long-term lunar exploration program. The International Lunar Research Station, planned as a joint Chinese-Russian project with other partners, has the far side as a primary target for later phases. The scientific interest in this hemisphere is accelerating globally. Data from Artemis II arrives at exactly the moment when multiple space agencies and programs are planning their approaches to this territory. What the crew sees, records, and reports will enter a scientific conversation that is larger than any single mission. They will photograph it with high-definition cameras mounted on the spacecraft's exterior. They will record measurements from spectrometers and radiation detectors. They will make spoken observations into mission recorders, describing what they see in their own words, in real time, with their own judgment. And then they will continue past the far side and begin the long curve that turns them away from the Moon and points them home. The far side will disappear behind them. The Earth will grow in their windows again. And what they carry back, the data, the images, the observations, the memory of seeing with their own eyes a world that no living human had ever seen before, will be one of the most important scientific returns of the entire Artemis program. Not because it is the most dramatic part of the mission, but because it is the part that only humans could do. When the Artemis I capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on December 11, 2022, it looked like a complete success. The spacecraft had flown around the moon and back. It had travelled farther than any crewed-rated capsule had ever been tested. It had survived re-entry and landed within sight of the recovery ship. Every major system had performed within design parameters. Mission controllers in Houston celebrated. The program leadership called it a triumph, and by every visible measure it was. Then the engineers took the heat shield apart. What they found changed the mood considerably. Across the surface of the Orion heat shield, in more than 100 separate locations, the ablative material had not behaved the way the model said it would. Instead of eroding smoothly and gradually, burning away in a controlled, even fashion and carrying heat energy with it as it went, the material had cracked. It had fractured along irregular lines and broken off in chunks, not tiny flakes, chunks, pieces of heat shield material ranging from small fragments to sections several inches across had separated from the surface during re-entry in a pattern that nobody had predicted and nobody had designed for. And it got worse. 4 separation bolts embedded in the heat shield, structural fasteners that held the service module in place until jettison, had burned through their thermal barriers during re-entry. The expected char pattern around each bolt was not there. Instead, there were deep gouges in the material around each fastener, suggesting that the heat had penetrated further and faster in those areas than the thermal models had calculated. The investigation that followed took nearly 2 years. Teams of engineers, material scientists and aerodynamicists worked through the data from Artemis I, ran new computational simulations, performed new ground tests, and gradually assembled a picture of what had gone wrong. The answer, when it finally came, was both technically specific and deeply unsettling in what it revealed about the limits of ground testing. The heat shield material is called avcoat. It is a substance that has been used on spacecraft since the Apollo era, a mixture of silica fibers and epoxy resin applied in a honeycomb matrix to the surface of the capsule. When it enters a hot atmosphere at high speed, it is supposed to absorb heat, char and ablate, meaning it burns away in a controlled, gradual process that carries thermal energy away from the capsule surface and prevents that heat from reaching the crew module behind it. It is not trying to be indestructible, it is trying to be sacrificial. The whole point is that the material burns so the spacecraft does not. On Artemis I, the ablation did not happen the way it was supposed to. What the investigation found was that during re-entry, gases generated inside the avcoat material, produced by the chemical reactions of ablation itself, could not escape fast enough through the charred surface layer above them. Pressure built up inside the material, and when the pressure exceeded the structural strength of the avcoat, the material cracked and blew off sections from the inside. Not erosion, explosion. Small, contained, but real. The root cause was connected to the specific re-entry profile flown by Artemis I. That mission used a technique called skip re-entry. Orion dipped into the upper atmosphere, used aerodynamic drag to slow down slightly and bleed off some of its energy, then skipped back out into space like a stone bouncing off the surface of a pond, before re-entering a second time for final descent. This technique is designed to reduce the peak heating rate the shield experiences and to give the crew a gentler deceleration profile. On paper, it is a smart approach. The problem was what happened in the pause between the 2 atmospheric passes. During the skip, the brief period when Orion was back in space between its 2 re-entry phases, heat energy that had been absorbed into the avcoat during the first atmospheric contact had time to redistribute inside the material. Instead of being carried away by ongoing ablation, it soaked deeper into the shield. When Orion re-entered for the second time, the material was already thermally compromised in ways the ground tests had not anticipated. The gases generated during the second heating phase had even less ability to escape than normal. The pressure built faster. The cracking was the result. Here is what makes this particularly troubling from an engineering perspective. NASA's ground testing facilities, the arcjet tunnels and plasma torches used to simulate re-entry heating, had tested the avcoat material extensively before Artemis I flew. Those tests showed the material performing correctly, ablating smoothly, no cracking, no irregular loss of material. The model said it would work. The ground tests confirmed the models, and then the actual flight broke it anyway. The reason the ground tests missed it is subtle but important. The arcjet facilities used to test the material typically simulate heating rates at the higher end of the expected range, because engineers want to be confident the material can handle the worst case. At those higher heating rates, the gases generated inside the avcoat escape more easily because the surface is ablating faster, creating more pathways for gas to vent. It was the moderate, sustained heating of the skip re-entry second phase that created the conditions where gas could not escape fast enough. The ground tests had never specifically replicated that moderate, sustained profile applied to material that had already been partially heated by an earlier atmospheric contact. It was a gap between the test environment and the real flight environment, small enough to be invisible until it was not. NASA spent 2 years staring at that gap, and the solution they arrived at is not the one most people expected. They did not redesign the heat shield. They did not replace the avcoat with a different material. They did not add additional thickness or change the honeycomb geometry, or introduce new venting pathways to help the gases escape. All of those options were studied, all of them were considered, and all of them were rejected for a combination of technical, schedule, and cost reasons that the program could not absorb before the Artemis II launch date. What NASA changed instead was the trajectory. The re-entry profile for Artemis II will not use skip re-entry. Orion will enter the atmosphere on a steeper, more direct path. One continuous descent from the moment the capsule hits the upper atmosphere to the moment the parachutes deploy. No bounce, no pause, no second phase. The shield will experience one continuous heating event rather than 2 separate ones. And the ablation will proceed in the steady, controlled manner the models were originally built around. The trade-off is real and the crew knows it. A steeper entry means a faster deceleration. A faster deceleration means higher G-forces on the crew during those final minutes of re-entry. Instead of the relatively gentle forces the skip profile produces, the Artemis II crew will experience a harder, more compressed deceleration profile. The difference is not extreme enough to be medically dangerous, but it is enough to be felt. Bodies that have spent 10 days in microgravity, bones and muscles softened by weightlessness, will be pushed back into their seats by forces greater than a standard re-entry would produce. And throughout all of this, the higher G-forces, the plasma wrapping around the capsule, the communications blackout, the minutes of isolation inside a fireball, the heat shield will be doing its job, or it will not. The cracking on Artemis. I did not cause a catastrophic failure. The capsule came home, but it came home with a shield that was more damaged than it should have been. For a crewed mission, that margin matters enormously. There is no post-flight inspection where you discover the crew experienced something the shield barely survived. The engineers believe the new trajectory solves the problem. The data supports that belief. The physics makes sense, and belief supported by data and physics is what aerospace engineering runs on. But belief is not certainty. The changed trajectory has never been flown. This re-entry profile, with this shield material, on the steeper path, has not been tested at full scale in real flight conditions. Artemis II will be the test. The crew has seen the photographs of the cracked shield. They have read the investigation reports. They have sat in the briefings where engineers explained the root cause and the fix, and they said yes, they are going. There is a moment during re-entry when the crew of Artemis II will be unreachable, not difficult to contact. not experiencing interference or static on the line, completely, absolutely unreachable. The radio signals from Houston will be travelling toward them at the speed of light, the fastest anything in the universe can move, and they will not get through. Because surrounding the Orion capsule will be a sheath of superheated plasma so electrically charged that it blocks every radio frequency NASA uses. For several minutes, the crew will be alone inside a fireball, with no voice from the ground, no telemetry link, no data stream of any kind. Just heat and pressure and the sound of a spacecraft doing the most violent thing it has ever been asked to do. This is re-entry from lunar velocity, and it is in a completely different category from anything that happens during a mission to the International Space Station. When a Crew Dragon or a Soyuz capsule returns from the station, it is coming home from low Earth orbit. Its orbital velocity is roughly 17,500 miles per hour. Re-entry from that speed is demanding. The capsule gets hot, the crew feels significant G-forces, the heat shield earns its place. But it is a well-understood process that has been performed dozens of times. The physics are known, the heating rates are predictable, the materials respond the way the models say they will, because they have been tested under those exact conditions repeatedly. Artemis II is not coming home from low Earth orbit. It is coming home from the moon. And the difference in velocity between those two situations is the difference between a difficult problem and an almost incomprehensibly violent one. The Orion capsule will hit the top of Earth's atmosphere at approximately 40,000 kilometers per hour. Convert that to a number your body can hold on to. That is roughly 25,000 miles per hour, Mach 32. 32 times the speed of sound. At that speed, the air in front of the capsule does not have time to move out of the way. It cannot flow around the vehicle fast enough. Instead, it compresses violently, almost instantaneously, and that compression converts kinetic energy into heat with ferocious efficiency. The air molecules in front of Orion do not just get warm, they get so hot that they shed their electrons entirely and become plasma. The fourth state of matter, a superheated soup of charged particles glowing white and orange and reaching temperatures of approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is roughly half the temperature of the surface of the Sun. Not a distant star's corona. Not some exotic astrophysical environment. Half the temperature of the surface of the nearest star, wrapped around a capsule containing 4 living human beings, generated by nothing more exotic than air molecules being compressed too quickly to respond normally. Between the crew and that plasma, a few inches of avcoat, a resin-coated silica material designed to absorb heat, char, and burn away in a controlled fashion. A material that cracked in more than 100 places the last time it was used. A material that NASA chose not to replace. A few inches of carefully engineered chemistry standing between the crew of Artemis II and incineration at half the temperature of the Sun. That is the margin they are working with. Inside the capsule, the experience builds in stages. The first sign of atmospheric contact is subtle. A faint vibration as the air begins to push back against the vehicle. Then a gentle deceleration, the first hint of weight returning to bodies that have been weightless for 10 days. After floating freely since shortly after launch, suddenly there is a direction again. Down reasserts itself. The crew, still strapped into their seats where they reposition themselves for re-entry, begin to feel their own weight. Not much at first. Just the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of gravity remembering them. Then it builds. The deceleration increases as the atmosphere thickens and the capsule slows. The G-forces climb, 1G, 2G. On the steeper direct entry profile chosen for Artemis II, the peak deceleration will be higher than the skip re-entry used on Artemis I would have produced. Bodies that spent 10 days being weightless, muscles that have been slowly losing strength since the moment the engines cut off after launch, are now being pressed into seats with a force that makes everything heavy. Arms are heavy. Heads are heavy. Breathing requires real muscular effort because the weight of the chest wall is working against the diaphragm. Every breath is a small act of physical work. Outside, the windows change. First, a faint orange glow appears at the edges, the first light of re-entry plasma wrapping around the capsule's rim. Then brighter. Then the entire field of view outside the windows shifts to deep orange, then to a blinding pulsing white. The plasma sheath is fully formed. The capsule is completely enveloped in fire generated by its own speed. There is nothing to see through the windows except the colour of extreme heat, shifting and churning as the superheated gases flow around the curved surface of the shield below them. And then the radios go quiet. Not gradually, suddenly. The plasma envelope is so electrically charged that it forms an impenetrable barrier to radio signals. One moment Houston is on the line, voices clear and calm, reading out data and giving the crew confirmation that everything looks nominal. The next moment, there is nothing. Silence on every frequency. The communications blackout during re-entry from lunar velocity lasts several minutes. During that time, Mission Control watches the telemetry drop to nothing and waits. There is nothing else they can do. Everything that could be prepared has been prepared. Every system check has been run. Every procedure has been rehearsed. The capsule and the crew are on their own until the plasma clears. Inside the capsule, the crew knows this moment was coming. They trained for it. They understand exactly why the radios went silent and approximately how long the blackout will last. Understanding it does not make it less profound. 4 people, pressed into their seats by forces that make their bodies heavy, surrounded by windows glowing white with plasma fire, in complete radio silence, travelling at speeds no human being has survived before. The only sounds are the structural groaning of the capsule under aerodynamic load, the muffled roar of superheated gas flowing around the hull, and the continuous hum of the life support fans that have not stopped running since launch. Then gradually the light fades. The plasma sheath thins as the capsule slows. Orange fades back through the windows. The deceleration begins to ease, and the radios crackle back to life. Houston's voice returns, calm, professional, asking for a status check. The crew responds. They're intact. The capsule is intact. The heat shield did its job. Now the capsule is subsonic, below the speed of sound for the first time since it left the launch pad. 2 small drogue parachutes deploy from the top of the capsule, snapping it into a more stable attitude and beginning the final deceleration. Then 3 massive main parachutes bloom open above the Pacific Ocean near San Diego. Each one is over 116 feet in diameter when fully inflated. Together they slow the capsule from approximately 300 miles per hour to roughly 20 miles per hour by the time it reaches the water. Splashdown is not gentle. The capsule hits the ocean surface with a force that the crew feels in their bones, a hard, definitive impact after the long floating silence of the parachute descent. The vehicle bobs in the Pacific swells. A US Navy recovery team on a San Antonio-class amphibious transport ship moves in. Divers enter the water and attach flotation collars and tow lines. The capsule is winched aboard the ship. The hatch opens. 4 people breathe outdoor air for the first time in 10 days. Their legs are weak. Their sense of balance is unreliable, because 10 days of microgravity has recalibrated their inner ears away from a world where gravity exists. Standing upright requires concentration. Walking requires effort. The body that left Earth 10 days ago and the body that returns are measurably different. Slightly lighter in bone density, slightly reduced in muscle mass. Blood redistributed. Vision possibly affected by the fluid shifts that happen in microgravity. Recovery will take days. Full readaptation will take weeks. But they are home, and the heat shield held. there is a door that has been closed for 53 years. Not a physical door, not a hatch on a spacecraft or a gate at a launch facility. A door in the history of what human beings have been willing to do. In December of 1972, Gene Cernan climbed off the lunar surface, and that door swung shut behind him, not locked, not sealed permanently, just closed, quietly, without ceremony. Without anyone deciding it was closed, it simply stopped opening. And for half a century, everything humanity did in space happened on the near side of that door, in low Earth orbit, in the comfortable, familiar territory where rescue was always hours away, and the Earth always filled the window, and the rules of survival were well understood and rehearsed. Artemis II is the hand reaching for that door again. But here is what the splashdown of Artemis II will actually mean. Not what the press releases will say, not what the speeches will describe, what it will actually mean, in physical, measurable engineering terms. It will mean that a human crew has travelled beyond the magnetosphere and returned. It will mean that the Orion capsule has demonstrated, with people inside it, that it can sustain life across 10 days in deep space. It will mean that the heat shield, the one that cracked in more than 100 places on Artemis I, performed correctly on a steeper trajectory with a crew depending on it. It will mean that the Space Launch System, which has flown exactly once before this mission, has now flown twice. It will mean that 4 specific human bodies have provided real biological data about what deep space does to people. Radiation absorption measurements, cardiovascular data, bone density changes, fluid shift records, psychological performance metrics. Data that no simulation and no animal study and no uncrewed flight can produce. Each of these things matters independently. Together, they matter enormously, because every one of them is a prerequisite for what comes next. Artemis III cannot happen without Artemis II proving the vehicle works with people aboard. Future long-duration lunar surface missions cannot be planned without the radiation data Artemis II collects. The Lunar Gateway Station cannot be designed around crew needs without understanding how Orion actually performs as a deep space transport. Every ambitious thing humanity wants to do in the coming decades of space exploration has Artemis II somewhere in its foundation. It is not a destination, it is a foundation stone. And yet there is something about this mission that cannot be captured in engineering requirements, or science objectives, or program milestones. Something that lives in the human dimension of what is happening. 4 people volunteered for this. They were selected from a pool of candidates. Yes, trained extensively. Yes, supported by thousands of engineers and scientists and flight controllers. Yes. But in the end, each of them made a personal decision. A decision to sit on top of a rocket that has flown once and trust it. To fly in a capsule that has never carried a crew before and trust it. To depend on a heat shield that cracked on its first flight and trust that the engineers understood why and fixed it correctly. To travel farther from Earth than any living human being has ever been and trust that the physics, the math, the materials, and the people monitoring every system from Houston will bring them home. That decision, that specific, personal, fully informed act of trust in the face of genuine risk, is the thing that makes human spaceflight different from everything else we do. We send robots to Mars. We deploy telescopes to the edges of the solar system. We build particle accelerators and map the human genome and sequence the proteins of viruses. All of it is remarkable. None of it requires anyone to personally accept the possibility of not coming home. Reed Wiseman has seen the heat shield photographs. Victor Glover has read the investigation reports. Christina Koch has sat through the briefings where engineers explained in precise technical language exactly what went wrong and exactly why they believe the fix is sufficient. Jeremy Hansen has studied the radiation data and the abort procedures and the free return trajectory calculations. They know the risks, not abstractly, specifically, in detail, with numbers attached to them, and they said yes, there is something worth sitting with in that. The willingness of these 4 people to accept personal physical risk on behalf of a larger goal is not unique in human history. It appears throughout our story, in the people who crossed oceans in wooden ships before anyone knew what lay on the other side, in the test pilots who pushed experimental aircraft past their known limits, in the Apollo crews who flew on rockets that had never carried people before. It is a recurring human behaviour that is easy to admire from a distance and almost impossible to fully understand from the inside. What does it feel like to strap yourself into a machine that might kill you, knowing it might kill you, and choose to go anyway? None of us who have not done it can truly answer that. But the answer exists. It lived in Cernan and Armstrong and Collins and Lovell. It lives now in Wiseman and Glover and Koch and Hansen. And whatever it is made of, courage, curiosity, duty, the simple human need to go and see. It is the engine that actually powers space exploration. Not the RS-25s, not the upper stage. This, the thing that makes a person say yes. When the hatch opens after splashdown and these 4 people breathe Pacific air for the first time in 10 days, they will have done something that shifts the trajectory of human history in a small but real way. Not because of the distance they covered, not because of the data they collected, but because they proved the road is open again. The 250,000-mile road between Earth and Moon that was travelled 12 times in a span of 3 years between 1969 and 1972, and then abandoned for half a century. That road will have been travelled again. And once a road has been travelled twice, the 3rd journey becomes easier to imagine, and the 4th, and the 10th. Artemis III will carry astronauts to the lunar surface, the first humans to walk on the moon in more than 50 years, the first woman ever, the first person of colour ever. That mission depends on what Artemis II proves, and Artemis III is not the end, it is barely the beginning. The stated goal of the Artemis program is a sustained human presence on and around the moon. Not visits, not flags and footprints, but a permanent outpost, a lunar gateway station in orbit, habitats on the surface, the infrastructure of a second home, and beyond that the technologies and the experience that will eventually make a crewed mission to Mars not just possible but survivable. All of that begins here, with 4 people in a capsule the size of 2 minivans, eating rehydrated shrimp from pouches, sleeping tethered to walls, exercising on a glorified resistance band, sharing a toilet behind a curtain, staring out small windows at a far side of the moon that no living human has seen, holding their thumbs up to cover the entire Earth, and feeling, for a moment, the full, impossible weight of the distance between where they are and where they came from, and then coming home through the plasma, through the silence, through the fire, back to the water and the air and the gravity that has been waiting for them. When the hatch opens, take a breath with them. Let the air move through your lungs the way theirs will, with the particular relief of something you stopped noticing until you went 10 days without it. Feel the weight of your own body in your chair, the gentle, insistent pull of a planet that has never stopped holding you, even when you are not paying attention to it. You are here, on this warm, improbable, fragile world, breathing air that a magnetosphere keeps safe, held down by a gravity that shapes your bones and keeps your blood in your veins, under a sky that glows blue because the atmosphere scatters light in exactly the right way. Thankfemri, you did not choose to be born on the only world in the known universe that can sustain you without a spacecraft. But here you are, on it, in it, part of it. And somewhere above you, the road to the moon is open again. Let that thought carry you gently into the quiet. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of your body settle into wherever you are resting. The stars will still be there when you wake. The moon will still be there, and the 4 people who went closer to it than any living human being have ever been will have made it just a little less impossible to imagine going back. Rest now. The universe is not going anywhere, and neither are you.